So I'm going to start with this question. How long do you think it will take for the Western world to wake up and see how destructive the current gender identity narrative is?
Yeah, look, that is one of the million-dollar questions at the moment. I think it will take a very long time. I suspect it will be led by people who are what they call transgender regretters. And this is a really important point to note. Transgender regretters are a larger and larger group of people because there is what could only be described as a tidal wave of trans kids. And they're going to get to a point in life, many of them, where they realise that this has not made them happy, this has not solved their issues. To quote one trans regretter, "I didn't feel like a real man, how was I ever going to feel like a real woman?" It's a fair point, right? Now, there's going to be a lot of these people, and the numbers are increasing. For example, at one of these Truth of It Live conferences, I spoke, and somebody came up to me afterwards who was an ex-trans person, recently detransitioning. Now, we've got to be ready for that phenomenon. Churches are going to have to pick up the pieces because some of these individuals are really, I don't want to say this, I want to say this in the best way possible, like they're damaged because of what people have done to them. Because they were too young, they were pushed down a false path, and the harm that has befallen them is quite catastrophic because there are certain things that cannot be undone, even if they've only got to the stage of hormone therapy, which most of them will. And I remember speaking to Walt Heyer, who was one of the first gender reassignment patients in the world, and he said that the reason he can talk so freely about his experience and the reason he runs his transgender regret counselling service all over the world is because it's been such a long time since he detransitioned, and it's taken him many, many years to heal. And so there are people who are going to be really needy, and what I'm finding is that many of them are finding the church. Many of them are turning to Christianity because Christians tend to be those who are prepared to pick up the pieces. So let's be those people. And I think that as that wave increases, there's going to be more and more chance that their voices will be able to push back on this. I fear that the cowardice of so many at the moment will mean, and I mean those in policy and those in politics who just don't want to touch this stuff, will mean that it doesn't get the attention it deserves until that time. But that's just a memo, I guess, for the church at large to be ready to be to those people what they need because they're becoming more and more common. And this person, by the way, was in North Queensland, so it's here as well.
There's been a couple of questions about education and schooling, and so I'm just going to put them together in a form. How should current or one-day parents approach educating their children? And the question marks are homeschool, or do we need light in-state schools, even at the risk of indoctrination? And the other question is, how do we combat the education curriculums you speak of? So, I understand this from a parent and a grandparent's position. What do we do?
Yeah, I mean, my brothers and sisters all have kids, and this is one of the things they're grappling with as well. I would say that at the moment, I think that there are still schools that are reasonable. I trust the one we're in is a good school. And there are still options at this stage for parents who are extremely vigilant, who are always aware of what's going on in their kids' lives and at their kids' schools, and who have some appreciation of how to deal with these sorts of modern issues and topics. Because there is still something to be said, I think, for, when we were growing up, I remember Dad saying something all the time when I heard him speaking to others. He said, I want my children to have a real faith that survives in the real world. And one of the things he was committed to was that, with the appropriate amount of protection, and yes, taking sin very seriously and all these things, but not completely separating us out from the realities of the world. And I think that has really paid dividends. Now, I appreciate, however, that there are some circumstances where that's becoming impossible. And so for me, I think homeschooling is not my favorite thing, but I think it's becoming a necessary thing in many contexts. So I make no judgment on people as to how they choose. to pursue their pathways. But on the curriculum stuff, it's really important, firstly, that you counteract the lies by telling the truth and teaching the truth to your kids all the time. It's really important that you're highly involved as a parent, and so the teachers and the principal know about you and know what you think. And here's the other thing. If something goes wrong at school, and this has happened at some Christian schools as well, if something goes wrong, don't just contact people like Wendy and myself and say, help, what do we do? The school needs to hear from you. And I find very often a lot of parents don't have the courage to go to the school. And they don't have the courage to talk to their peers and say, we need to go together. And to raise a voice so that the school hears from parents who are saying what's happened is wrong or the decision made here is wrong for all of these reasons. So be a bold parent in that respect. And don't make a nuisance of yourself, but be bold when you have to be. And there's a lot of people who just, they don't like the reproach that comes from being the one that stands out. Well, we're going to have to get over that. Those days are gone. We're going to have to take it, bull by the horns and go for it. And so that's the best advice I can give. I don't have kids myself in school, so it's not the perfect question to ask me, but I think that in there's a few things to help.
The Israel Folau case, was that as straightforward as it should have been, i.e. Bible versus the worldview, and was it stressful or a good challenge to take on?
Was it stressful?
Okay.
I think I've wiped 10 years off my life expectancy. I mean, I'm really serious. That was really, oh heck yeah, that was stressful. Thank you. Yeah, look, I mean, all of these things are definitely stressful. I mean, there was a background game taking place there that the public didn't see. There was a real program of sort of nefarious and underhanded warfare, which was all coordinated from within Rugby Australia, to the extent that there were people calling up those like me who were advocating for Izzy, but also others who had agreed to be witnesses at a court case to simply try and peel away their support. And this woman rang me, and she had done a full background brief on me. She knew everything about my life, and she was using every lever she could to make me shut up. And this sort of stuff, really dark and nasty stuff, was going on all the time. So there was a lot there that people didn't see. It wasn't as straightforward as it should have been. And it was literally as simple as this man said something about that must be shut down. And that's the real ideologues behind it. That was their goal. You may remember it was reported by some in the press, truthfully, that Raylene Castle was asked at the tribunal whether or not, if Israel had posted a photocopy of the Bible on his Instagram, would he have been banned? And she said he would have been. The single-minded focus was as clear as we said it was. There was something very nasty going on in the background. So highly stressful, but look, this is the thing. It was David and Goliath. It really was. And at least in that chapter, David won, and it was all God's doing. And I look back on it, and it was extraordinary. And also, that's another moment where you see what God did, despite you, in many cases. So, great experience.
Yep. First question is an important one. They're all good questions, actually. Since the fallout of the investigation surrounding Ravi Zacharias, what is there for us as Christians to learn from the findings and collapse of RZIM?
Start with an easy one.
Yeah, they get harder.
Far out. Look, I mean, that whole thing is a huge tragedy, obviously. I don't need to go into that. For those of you who want to follow up, there are those who are still defending the legacy of Ravi, his wife and one of his sons, and they've set up a website. You can go and look at that if you like. I just say that to make sure that both sides of the issue are covered. But let's take the situation as it is, which is that it is as bad as it looks. For me, I must say the first thing I thought of when I read that report, firstly was grief, obviously, but the second thing was it made me alarmed at just how true the scripture is that says the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? And the real problem is that it's not only Ravi that had a human heart. We've all got a human heart. And that diagnosis applies to us all. And I guess it gave me chills, and I thought of that thing, there but for the grace of God go I. Now I want to be clear, I can't imagine myself doing that. I just can't imagine it. But of course, that might be the deception, because we're all capable of evil. And so it made me really just pray that God would preserve all in leadership from these things, pray about myself, and pray for the testimony of the church. And so I think the first thing I'd like to say is, the lesson for me was, how corrupt is the human heart, and how can I live so that such things don't ever come close to me, and that I never find myself so deceived that I'm walking even within 10% of that terrible situation. And so I'd encourage sober reflection. That's how I would say it. Now the rest, obviously, there's questions to be asked about, how organisations like ACL run ourselves, how people who are involved in ministry make themselves accountable and all that. I'll leave that to those who are working on those things. But for us all, I think a sober reflection of that nature is worthwhile, because our testimony is everything. And that's what we learned from the Ravi thing. His testimony was everything. And I really admire those who have been in Christian ministry for many years and have got an absolutely blameless integrity about them. And we need more of those sorts of people who can walk the talk.
Yeah, it's good. How do you navigate the information you look at on social media with not wasting time on it?
One would argue that opening social media is a waste of time straight away. That's not quite true. Look, I think it's like anything, right? Moderation. I've had to check myself on this in the past as well. You can. It's incredibly addictive. You can find yourself lying in bed scrolling Facebook. It's a terrible thing. If you find yourself doing that, just stop. It's like everything. It's discipline and it's moderation. And I would say that it is almost a forgotten Christian virtue, discipline. Because the Christian does, going into my last topic there about the identity and the self, the Christian brings the self under control in submission to Christ. And discipline is a really important virtue. I think particularly young people need to hear that. We're very random in our interactions. We can waste huge amounts of time. Young men, I think ill discipline is a sin of young men. And I say that as a young man. Endless surfing of YouTube, endless browsing of the internet, computer games. It's just a waste. And I don't apologise for saying that. You really, really need to use your mind and your time in far more virtuous pursuits if you want to be used by God because of the things that you have, and learn discipline and grow. So it's a good Christian virtue and something to always be convicted about, as I frequently am, and to grow in.
That's good, thank you. Since political movements are partially based on the size of the electorate they represent, is it a worry that less people are calling themselves Christians?
Look, yes and no. What I think is happening more than anything is that increasingly there is no social capital involved in calling yourself a Christian. And I think that there has been a long history in countries like Australia of what you might call cultural Christians. People who grew up attending maybe an Anglican church or a Presbyterian, they've got a denomination attached to them. And that's just part of their life. That's part of who they are. Probably they only go to church at Christmas. Are they a Christian? Are they truly converted? Don't know. So there's a lot of that going on. And so what I think we're seeing, one of the overwhelming patterns that we're seeing, is that there is far less social capital involved in identifying yourself with Christianity. But I am not so sure that actually the size of the convictional, practicing Christian church that really knows the Lord, I'm not so sure that that is shrinking in the same way. And I would say still, I have my socks blown off all over this country as to how strong and rich Christianity remains here. So I think that is a big part of it. And here's the other thing. It depends really what you're trying to do. So if politics is the only paradigm you're working in, then just numbers are everything. But God doesn't need numbers. I'm just very mindful of that. It's great that ACL is as big as it is and that we continue to grow so quickly, and praise God, because that's what He's given us for this season. But David did count his army and he was judged for it. Because, we rely ultimately on the power of God, and He raises up kings, He does. So what I would hope is that more than just have numbers on a page of supporters or numbers in church pews, I would hope that we're all people who pray to the God of heaven, who changes nations and changes lives.
And this question is an interesting one. Having smashed the biased quartet, National Press Club, The Project, 60 Minutes and Q+A, which of the 4 experiences felt the most rewarding?
Oh.
That's assuming you think you smashed them. We do. We think you smashed them, don't we?
Look, honestly, I don't necessarily feel that way. I feel very much that I'm in God's hands when I go into those situations. And I feel very much afterwards that I was helped. And I would say that most rewarding, I would say that every opportunity that I've had to really articulate something of the gospel has been my most rewarding moments. Like for Q&A, I prayed specifically, and I prayed before the project and others that, that God might give me that opportunity. And it just came along, rolled gold, just the door wide open. And I was, able to do it. And He gave me the words to speak. So I think that has been really tremendous. I mean, there's nothing like going into those situations to know that people are praying for you and to see prayer answered before your very eyes. It's really extraordinary. But also, I don't know the impact of those words. You think of Q&A, and even with the declining ratings, about 230,000 people watched that. Well, you think of, the biggest Billy Graham crusade was speaking to a stadium of 140,000 in Melbourne, right? That's the biggest crowd the MCG's ever had. And yes, it's a crusade and it's a full sermon, but these opportunities are weapons grade. You are reaching so many people, and you just don't know where people are at. And every Christian story has moments where they heard something. A rock was put in their shoe, a conviction came across their path. And I just am delighted that God is able to use the work that we do sometimes to further that cause.
What is your opinion when people say that people who are gay or lesbian have a chemical imbalance and are born like that?
Look, for what it's worth, I think it's reasonably clear that a person's makeup in their desires, including LGBT, is probably a fairly complicated mix of nature and nurture. I think, people could have a genetic predisposition in some sense. I also think that people obviously are profoundly shaped and affected by their environment. And I think there's a lot to be said about that, particularly in the LGBT community. And that's not me saying that. The studies show that there is, I think, a 3.5 times higher incidence of child sexual abuse, for example, in the LGBT community. And people say, that's a hateful thing to say. Well, no, it's not, because if we want to answer a question, we've got to tell the truth about it. If we want to help people, we've got to tell the truth about it. And that's the truth. That's just what the studies say. And it's not me, and it's not, it's not the sacred, King James Bible University of Southern Arkansas. That's coming from places like Harvard and all the rest of it. So there is, I think, a complex thing going on there. Probably there's a bit of column A, a bit of column B. But it's the same for all of us. We all have a sinful nature. We're born that way, in a sense. I don't have a problem with homosexuality, but I'm a man, and there's sexual desire for every person. But of course, we're called to submit our sexual desires, we're called to submit our passions and our feelings to God's will. That's not a gay thing, that's not a straight thing, that's a person thing. And actually what God has said to us is, there is a particular place and design for that, and that's it. End of story. And so that's what we honour and that's what we live for. And we will find in this culture that is probably the most demented and insane thing to believe. And that is why, and it really is, it's incomprehensible to the broader culture at large. But it probably is one of the practices in the Christian church, as was the case in the early church in Rome, that actually is most attractive. The early church, women flocked to the early church because they were treated with dignity, because there was sexual control and restraint. People who are not practicing these sins actually become very attractive people to the world of hurting individuals who have been harmed by these things, who have been hurt by these things, who have been ravaged by these things. And they look on at this community that is pure. And it's a marvellous and a tremendous thing. And I think it's really only by the power of God in an age like this that can happen. But if we can be those people, I think the church will again become, and is indeed becoming, a great magnet for the sexually broken and the people who are at their lowest of the low because of the abuses that this life can wreak upon them. One area I see that already is in the area of transgender regret. It's really interesting to me that all the transgender regretters that I meet, who have gone down the pathway of becoming a trans woman or a trans man, regretted it, face the awful reality of that, and it truly is awful. It's interesting, they're all Christians. They all come to Christ. They all come to the church. All the ones I've met, now they aren't all, but all the ones I've met are. It's an unbelievable mission field, if you like, if I could put it that way, where people find restoration and healing from what is one of the most dastardly things that can be done to a person. And so I think that's a real burden on the church for us to live up to that standard, because I think it is in that testimony and witness in a effectively pagan world that God can really work.
God chose Israel. Does he choose us as believers?
You know what? I've thought a lot about this, and I can't help but think that when it comes to this question, it's almost like we're trying to answer an unanswerable question. I think that the reality is my salvation, the things God leads me to do, all glory to God. I don't take any credit. What does Paul say? So no one can boast. And that's really, really important. So I say all glory to God. It's all his doing. He gets all the credit. It's all from him, and he leads me every day. He led me to him. He saved me, and all the rest of it. That's how I think about it. But then at the same time, I know that in my subjective experience of my salvation, I prayed, I wrestled out these things, I had faith. There's two sides to this coin. There's like God's perspective and there's our experience. And we say, to try and describe God's perspective, I'm going to get a bit heavy here, but we say we were predestined. In other words, we were chosen beforehand for what would happen later. But you've got to understand that God is not even living in time. Predestined doesn't really mean, what does it that's to help us understand what's going on. And it's to help us to understand that it is all of God, ultimately. But I think there's a mystery here, which is that, we do see people's choices having impacts. We do subjectively experience belief and faith and all of these things. But at the same time, God is saying, no, it's all from me. And the words that he uses to describe that are words that are just to help us understand, but we'll never fully plumb the mystery of that. And the tension I'm really describing is this. It's our responsibility versus God's sovereignty. And I've got to say, I will always take responsibility, but I'll always honour I will always praise God for his sovereignty. And so some people I've heard say, you should sleep like a Calvinist and live like an Arminian. In other words, get out there and be super, super busy and be responsible. But just know at the end of the day, God's got it. He's got it. And I do probably err on the side of saying, ultimately it is all of God, and he gets the glory and I get none.
I think that's a really good place to stop the Q&A tonight, because we've got some other things to finish on.
I'm not a theologian, by the way. Sorry,
Please thank Martin for his Q&A question and answer.
Thank you.
Okay, this one's an interesting one. Can women be in positions of power, such as Prime Minister? A Christian woman who aspires to make an impact through governmental leadership and motherhood?
Yeah, look, like I said before, I think what you read in Genesis is there's a centre of influence, or there's a centre of gravity, I suppose, for our vocations that is given there. And I don't think it's just a Genesis thing. I think it's impossible to get away from that throughout the entire Bible. So there is a first priority, okay? But I do know, so for example, the Attorney General at the moment, who we're going to meet in about a week's time, is Mackay. She's a woman who, she's got a Christian background, and she is in politics and is where she is because she cannot have children. It's the same with Peter Credlin. Many of you will know and follow her. There are clear exceptions of women that are called to be in those places. I do think though that there is a first priority and it's not politics. And a lot of people say, well, but that's power. And I sit there and go, well, hang on, where are you getting that idea? Any of us who want power, man or woman, we've got a problem. That's not a right foundation to work on at all. That's not, I mean, we get called to do what God calls us to do, full stop. And you can't just say that God calls you to whatever you feel like He calls you to. He calls you to what you hear from Him in the context of and the limitations of the Word of God. And so I would just put that out there as some basic principles to think about. I'm not prepared to say no, but then I'm not prepared to say yes. But I'm prepared to say, think about it and think about the emphasis, the focus, and the priority. Yeah.
Madeline writes, my sister identifies as gay and her wife, in inverted commas, transitioned to male. How do we, the church, speak the truth with love to those in these painful and confused situations?
Look, I think most of this is going to come through your actions. You will never be able to tell a lie. You'll never be able to agree with a lie. You'll never be able to pretend that you're on side with these things. You're just not going to be able to do that. And you shouldn't be the person who does that. It is interesting. You often find in the stories of people who come out of that sort of lifestyle, so people who are ex-trans, and there's more and more of them. In fact, I met one on this tour recently, ex-trans, who's become a Christian. But there's also ex-LGBT of all kinds. You very often find that it was a contradictory voice that they heard first. Or you find that, and this would be in the case of a guy like James Parker over in Perth, you find that he simply encountered Christians and a Christian community. The issue didn't even necessarily have to come up at first, but he was drawn in by their life, by who they were, and by their actions. And so I'd just say keep your Christian testimony clean and right, and always act towards other people in love, understanding that love is not defined by how they feel. Love is defined by the truth of God. Love is sacrificing yourself in the highest and best interests of other people. What are the highest and best interests of other people? Is it how they necessarily feel? No. Now, there is a way to do it which can be aware of that. But ultimately, it is in the highest and best interest that God has for your life and for theirs. Always bear that in mind. So you're always going to find yourself in that tension. That's good. It's a feature, not a bug. Keep in the tension. Keep acting towards them for all good, but do not compromise on your beliefs and what you say. You could find that God reaches them through your contradictory voice. You could find that God reaches them through your warmth and affection. It will be either one. It can be both.
Yeah, it's good. The new national curriculum in the area of health states that schools must affirm students' sexual and gender identity. Legally, what does this mean?
Well, it's not a law, the national curriculum. It's not a law. So that's the first important thing. The law that you're bound by if you're in a school, for example, in a school environment, or you're running a school, is defined in things like the Education Act and so forth. But here's the thing, even if the law, and the law doesn't, affirm, the law is actually fairly unclear on a lot of this stuff. The most controversial thing you could find under the law is, if you have trans kids in the school, do they have to be able to use the bathroom of their choice and all that kind of stuff, wear the uniform of their choice? The law actually isn't very clear on that. We need a test case to find out what transgender discrimination means, because in those specific contexts, it's not actually clear. And so I come back to my original point, which is do the right thing today and leave the rest in God's hands. And I'm very grateful for a lot of schools that are doing that and really sticking by it. And there's many of them, really good ones. But there are some, and I know of some, who haven't done that, and they open the door to compromise. And that's it, basically. The whole culture of the school changes. You've got nowhere to go back to. You've got no firm foundation. It's over. So I think we should hold the line, not worry too much about those issues, because even though it says it again, it's not the law. Get good legal advice when it goes wrong. But hold the line and leave the rest up to God. It's always the best advice.
How do we encourage young Christian men to be confident and brave when many times they are meek and backward in coming forward?
Well, meek's a good quality to have. I just want to say it's a beatitude, but I know what you mean. This is a really good question. So, I'll tell you two things that are a problem for young boys that I think parents need to address on the whole a lot better. One is that one of the sins of youth for young men is, I say, indolence, for those who know the meaning of that word, idleness. They can watch YouTube for 10 hours. They can play video games for 24 hours. They can lock themselves in their rooms with the door shut and do all sorts of things they shouldn't be doing. I don't understand why any parent would tolerate that, because it's destroying them. And they are wasting their time. And the only way a young man is ever going to be what he ought to be is if he learns to bring himself under discipline. And that is possibly one of the most important things. And this is something that bothers me all the time, is discipline, discipline, discipline. It's a Christian virtue that's long forgotten. And it is a virtue because we have sinful natures, and left to ourselves we go to rot. But actually we can bring our sinful natures under the control of what is good. And God can help us to do that. So for a young man, he first has to get his disciplines in order. And if he spends his time well, and he spends his time studying what he should study, and getting out there and doing the things he should do, then that's going to pay massive dividends when he gets a little bit older. That's the first thing to address. The second thing to address, if it can come to me in just a second, is, yes. One of the things, and this is something that Dad showed me very young, there's a few things actually that I learned from my dad. One was learn wisdom. With all thy getting, get wisdom, he used to say, which is a really important point. Wisdom is a Christian virtue, and I think men are, in their leadership role in the family and whatnot, they need to be wise. Solomon knew he had to be wise in leadership. He prayed for it, and God gave it to him. So learn wisdom. But that wasn't the point. The point was, and it's gone from me again, gosh, this is important. Yes, they need to take responsibility. I think a lot of fellas are terrified of taking responsibility. And very often they fall into a trap of failure. So they will, I meet guys all the time, they started a uni degree, didn't get on with it, they quit. And then they might try and start another program or course and don't get on with it and don't finish. This is a toxic spiral. They've got to achieve. They've got to achieve. It is so important to the psychology of a young bloke that he achieves things. And if you're a parent, push him and keep pushing him. And he might spit at you in the eye, but you've got to do it for his own good. Push him and make him finish. And I'm so glad that I was pushed to do things, to take on responsibility. And young women who are concerned about young men, and a lot of young women are, and concerned about the availability of young men and the quality of young men. Okay, I'll tell you a little story. When I was 18 years old, right, and I was scared of my own shadow, a young woman came to me and said, I want to start a youth group in this church. And I said, well, good for you. And she'd had a lot of experience teaching kids. So I thought, well, she's the perfect person. And she said, no, I want you to lead it. And I thought, well, not so good. I said, my actual answer was, I don't know how to talk to kids. And she said, but you can learn. And she said, look, I know what to do. I've got it all sorted out. I understand how this works. I've got your back. It's going to be fine, but I want you to lead it. And she actually championed me into that role, and she had my back, and she backed me up. I just want to say, if it wasn't for that experience of my life, the 6 years in youth ministry, I would not be on this stage right now. Just think a little bit. Just think a little bit about what you can do to actually make the man the man. And yes, sometimes it means you've got to step into the background, which isn't very popular these days. But you know, one of the greatest services, for men and women actually, I mean, I'm not here by design, it just happened. For men and women, one of the greatest services is to serve unseen and unnoticed, because God sees, and he particularly rewards that. So just that's a story that might help some.